All right, I think we're doing it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi,
Good
Len.
morning, everybody. We are studying today with our study session that is every Wednesday at 10:30. I think I said that poorly, but welcome everyone to our Wednesday study session as we deal with and discuss various topics. We just spent 3 weeks on Jewish authors, and today we're going to talk about 19th century philanthropists, mostly in America, obviously very well-known families that are still in many cases well-known today. So welcome again, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about the reasons that these philanthropists came to America. But in most cases, we're talking about 19th century Jewish philanthropists who generally started their businesses after 1840. And in some cases continue to this day, and in some cases only recently closed, i.e. the Lehman Brothers, for instance. But there are so many of them that obviously we can't get to all of them. And ironically, or not ironically, they're all very famous. Most of them, of course, ended up in New York. That's the Our Crowd. There's a wonderful book about them. But there are others like Levi Strauss, who of course are based in San Francisco. Others, of course, like the Rothschild family, are still based in Europe, but they're not part of what we'd call this German immigration 19th century group solely because they really had started their dominance in several fields before the 1840s. So why were there so many German Jews who came to America and became so prominent? Now we'll do a little bit of history on the reasons why they came here first, and then we'll go into some of the individuals. But I think many of us know the reasons are pretty obvious, as in many cases. So what we see is in the 18th century, there were a few Jews who came to America. A lot of first wave was also obviously Sephardic. You started having smidgens of German Jews come already here, but really that was a very small number. What happened in Germany to cause this first massive immigration? Now you got to remember in 1820, I think there were maybe 10,000 to 15,000 Jews in America. By 1881, there would be 250,000 Jews,
Wow.
almost all of them German. The German Jews aren't as well known today because from 1881 to 1924, there'd be 3.5 million Eastern European Jews moving in.
Snowball.
So just like the German Jews overwhelmed the Sephardic Jews, the Eastern European Jews would overwhelm number-wise the German Jews. Now, even though the Sephardic Jews did very well, many of them, they did not reach the heights of the German Jews. Now, why did the German Jews come to America? Well, there's a variety of reasons. It starts probably with the Napoleonic Wars. You had Napoleon who takes over France, creates a freedom that Jews and people have never seen before. And he starts to go to war with the rest of Europe, trying to influence them to give these freedoms. Obviously, he loses. And by 1815, there is disarray in places, especially like Germany. He had ended the Holy Roman Empire. And now you had this federation, which was really more of a confederation of German states. Now, the big difference was whereas France and England and other countries were united and became individual countries, this did not happen in Germany. You had 20, 30, 40 different small German states. Some of them were bigger and more powerful, obviously. And so you had Jews all over these places during these tumultuous times. And several things happened that caused this immigration. One, there was a dissension between the belief as to whether we should give more freedom or less freedom. So at times more freedom was given to Jews, then it was restricted depending on what was going on. Secondly, the German Confederation started to become more industrial. thus leaving areas of agricultural, where a lot of the Jews lived, barren and less hospitable, and less, there was, basically less jobs. There also began to come restrictions on Jews that kind of rallying against what Napoleon did. Some of them included that Jews could not get married unless they had a special permission slip, unless they had a certain type of, well, basically it was a catch-22. You had to pay an exorbitant amount of money to get married. And then once you paid it, then you had to prove you had a certain kind of job, which often Jews weren't allowed. So you had all these single men who could not get married and could not find jobs. And then there was some very serious, not czarist persecution, but certainly persecutions against the Jews in various areas. So it was single guys, unable to find jobs, persecution, civil disobedience, which would continue all the way really from 1815 to the Civil War in 1848. And so Jews started leaving in droves. It's mostly young single men who would come to America as the Eastern Europeans would do, and then get jobs, and then eventually bring over the rest of their family, their siblings, and their parents. Very similar to what the Eastern European Jews did, just on a smaller scale, about maybe 12 to 14 to 1 in terms of the numbers. So you had these German Jews moving to America. They had an advantage over the Eastern European Jews in some ways, one of which was they were usually educated a little bit more in the world than the Eastern European Jews, who were all educated, but mostly only in Talmud and that in Jewish studies. Where the Eastern Europe Jews from Germany, there had been Jews that had succeeded very well in Germany in various businesses. So they had some experience with business in some ways. Number two, a lot of them came over and were coming to relatives who have already been established. So the first wave came and kind of settled, and the second wave came and just helped these businesses. What were these businesses? A lot of them were very obvious. A lot of them were, of course, retail. At least they started that way, but often they would go into other places, especially banking and financing, which would become prohibited from Jews later on. But if you got into it early enough, they didn't dominate, but there were some very important ones. So it was a wide range of fields, from, of course, mercantilism to banking to railroads to finance. So it ran the gamut. And they, of course, some of them were ruthless. They followed the tradition, a lot of them, of being very philanthropic, some of them while they were gaining their wealth, some of them after they gained their wealth and they kind of gave it away later on in life. And we know some of those names who had done that. The most famous would be, of course, the non-Jewish Rockefellers, who weren't Jewish, but there were many Jewish families, mainly people like Schiff and Levi Strauss, who gave untold amount of money. They're also very unique in that the wealth of the family continued for a very long time, sometimes all the way till today. And we know, the Rothschilds, obviously, the Guggenheims, there's various ones that the wealth stayed in the family, even though the family, of course, expanded, they were able to stay together in many respects. There was also a lot of intermarriage between various members of this art crowd, most famously the Schiff and the Cohns and the Cohns. So I don't know how to pronounce it. And I just forgot the last name of the other ones. Well, the main one. So there was a wide range of everything. So it was kind of like a perfect storm. They came to a country, America, where there was not a lot of anti-Semitism. There was some, but the anti-Semitism would increase really during the Eastern European immigration, because all of a sudden there's so many Jews. 253,000 Jews spread over America. although the numbers did increase exponentially in New York, it wasn't this immediate move to millions of people. So there wasn't quite, and ironically, it was one of these Our Crowd group that led to anti-Semitism, with him fighting anti-Semitism, and we'll probably talk about that in a second. So if anybody wants to start with anything they know about it before we continue, let me know. Anybody have any thoughts on what they'd like to talk about? Again, there's no way we can talk about all of them. There's no way we could talk. And I thought about, well, we'll dive into the Rothschild family, but of course that is, the Rothschild family is a very big family through the years. And so, so any thoughts before we continue? We'll start with Jeff, and then we'll go to Larry.
Yeah, the word Kuhn, it's not Cohn, it's
Kuhn, right.
Right.
I knew it was,
very, very interesting book. I'd recommend to you, Rab. I don't know if you've read it, The House of Morgan.
I have not read that book.
Okay, that's Ron Chernow, who has later become famous for his books on Hamilton,
Right.
which the play is based on. But Chernow's first book was The House of Morgan, and it's a study into the entire banking industry. Now, of course, Morgan was certainly not Jewish. They were quite anti-Semitic, as a matter of fact, and very Episcopalian. But it mentions all the other banks and how the relations, they would often work together hand and foot. But
Right.
It's an absolutely fascinating book. I want to go back and read Our Crowd, because I don't remember what year that came out, but it's time for a reread.
Yeah, that's the book, obviously, that that mostly deals with, or maybe even exclusively with, the New York Jews, because a lot of them ended up there. But there's certainly many others. Now, this is just a smidgen. I mean, there were others who did very well, but obviously Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, Levi Strauss, Guggenheim, Schiff and Seligman and Kuhn. Those are the names that continue to be famous today, along with Rothschild and Montefiore. Actually, Moses Montefiore, who we're not going to talk about today, it was just too much to do, actually came and visited our synagogue, promoting Zionism, pre-Zionism, promoting, supporting his. I don't know if anybody knew that, but apparently what happened was he came here and he signed a book that he had written about immigration to Israel, and it got lost or taken, and a congregant actually bought it recently in the last 3 or 4 years on eBay. So for a very substantial amount. So who knows if that'll ever be donated to our congregation. It was very generous of them to buy it back. And so, so our congregation was not great about keeping all of this history really until probably the 1980s. But he did come and speak here. And obviously, I don't know if we had a lot of support for the pre-Zionist. But let's go over some of these. We'll start with my family, obviously, the Haas family, which is unfortunate that I'm not of the major Haas family. If any of you have ever been to the Bay Area, and if any of you have ever gone and done, I lived in San Francisco 1 year, and I can tell you any place I went where my last name was mentioned, there was like an, ooh, look, because the Haas family has been very philanthropic for 150 years, at the time 130 years straight. Most of it privately, but so much so that everybody knew the family, and that Levi Strauss had done so much in the family. So who is Levi Strauss? Again, the same as every one of these people we'll be talking about. Every one of those people mentioned was born in some place in Germany, often Bavaria, because Bavaria kind of was like way out there, was struggling to become more of a cultured and industrious area. And Levi Strauss was from that area. And so I think many of you, anybody here been to San Francisco and heard all the things the Haas family's done? Basically, his son-in-law was a Haas. That's why it's in the Haas family. But we're going to talk about Levi Strauss. very simple again, born in Germany, obviously, in a place called Butenheim in Bavaria. So during this time of the Confederation or Federation of German States, this is kind of pre the naming of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And at 18, he came to the US because his brothers were always here. He came with his mother and his sister. We're talking 1847-ish, right before the Civil War, but everybody knew it was brewing. And his family already had as we know, some sort of mercantile supply business. What they called it back then, what did they call it? I never knew growing up what dry goods were. I just knew what they were, you know. I remember my dad and grandfather mentioning the word, but I didn't know what it was, even though that was the business they were in. And so they had dry goods, obviously dry good business, as so many did, but they already had it in various places. They are not a New York family. They were living in St. Louis, in Louisville, and so they lived in these other places, and they eventually spread out. And he was sent to California. Why was he sent to California? Because of the gold rush. And the family, I don't know if they knew as much as we know now, but they realized that the only people who make money in a gold rush are the people selling the equipment. And that's how they made a lot of their money. So he's over there in the Bay Area. I don't remember exactly where. And selling, of course, these goods to these gold rush people. And a friend of his comes up to him and says, you know, I have this thing called denim. Why don't we use it to make pants? And he thought it was a good idea. So he and this friend got the patent for the denim pants. And of course, the rest is history. He, of course, ended up putting pants on everybody, including me right now. If you're wondering, did I wear Levi's intentionally because I'm talking about him today? No, I wear them because I wear them almost every day now, because I am a blue jean man again for the first time since high school. So he started this business, and eventually, obviously, it took off. And what we have today is the company that was later moved to the Haas family. He actually had no children. Actually, no, did he have children? No, he had children. Now I'm forgetting if he had children. Which one did have? I forgot if he had children or not, but ends up, I think his niece ends up marrying a Haas that takes over the company. And so, again, if you live in San Francisco, you know the name, because he personally created an incredible number of funds at Cal Berkeley, but also they've given to a wide range of areas, from support of Israel, very Zionistic, to HIV, to hospitals, to basically every single thing you can imagine they have given money to. Why do we know this? Because in most cases, they give anonymously. But they're so well known for giving that even when they give anonymously, a lot of people know they're giving. And not only Levi Strauss, but the Haas family has become synonymous with donations. So wherever you go in the Bay Area, including the shul, you will see Haas family, Haas family, Haas family. You go to Israel, they have the Haas Promenade. Although I don't think that's that family, just I think it's cool if you have the Haas Promenade. So he proved that you could market something around the country at the same time. And as we know, it succeeded very well. And Levi Strauss, I'd say most people don't even realize that Levi Strauss is actually the name of a person. They actually think it's just the company. But also, to his credit, he was a Reformed Jew. So that was really one of the great things about him. And his partner, well, was a partner, sort of partner, but he and Jacob W. Davis. So we talk about him because he helped establish Congregation Emmanuel, which is the first synagogue in San Francisco, which I went to many times. Of course, there's the Levi Strauss Foundation, which is still around. His house is a museum. So, and the family to this day owns Levi Strauss. I think it's a privately owned company to this day. So that's, and it's still the Haas family, which shows that for all these generations, one family has still been in charge of this. So it's a really incredible tale. Any questions about him? We're going to go through these pretty quickly because I want to get through several more before we finish.
Were there two separate people then, Levi and Strauss?
No, Levi Strauss is his name.
Oh, that's his first name was Lee. Okay, I got it.
Levi is his first name. Strauss is his last name.
I got it.
So, and they also, the later family came up with the ideas of all these various ways to create funds for charity that are used to this day. I'm not as familiar, obviously, with how these funds work because obviously I don't know how they work, and that will mean I'm not going to retire till I'm 107. But truly what we call a mensch and somebody who is a prime example of this group of German Jews that became very wealthy. I don't know if he's the most famous of them. He's certainly one of the most famous. Another of the most famous one would obviously be the Guggenheim families. We're going to start off with the famous because I don't think we're going to get through any. But of course, Meyer Guggenheim is a name that we know of because of his family. We don't know, whereas Levi Strauss, his name is very famous because the name of the company. Meyer Guggenheim isn't famous, it's his family that's famous, and he's kind of the patriarch of the family. He was actually born in Switzerland, but of course, Switzerland and Germany were all pretty much one at that time, or very close. And he made his fortune in, anybody know what? Mining, and also later smelting.
Yeah,
So that's what, and what more time?
Copper was his
And
big
copper
thing.
was what initiated it.
Right.
So copper was the beginning, and then eventually into silver and smelting and a wide range, and then also into other things afterwards. But they basically got out when they're getting, so he came here. His brothers were already here. They had already invested in some of these. And so he started first in copper, buying a copper mine, and then eventually, of course, went into smelting and created his big refining company. He, unlike Strauss, had a lot of kids. He had 7 sons, most of whom stayed in the business. That's how it kept it in the family. Some of them, of course, became more of the creating the trust and the more philanthropic wing of his. But basically, you don't think of Jews as being miners and smelters. Think of him maybe except in the diamond business, or but that's where he made his money. He became, of course, more famous for all of the foundations they donated, and of course for the famous art they collected, which a lot of it went to the Guggenheim Museum, as we know. Some of it went to other places, but that's where they're probably most well known today, is for the donation of their art. And so basically, Meyer started the company, but his sons then started buying mines all around the world, from Alaska to Africa to South America. They were buying mines, and really that's where they made money. And they created this international company, which many people do not realize. But as we know today, although they gave a lot of money to a wide range of fields, they're mostly remembered for giving money for the art museums. Any questions or thoughts of them? And then we're just going to go through a couple of these because we only have time. If we want to go through anything more specifically, we can. All right. So the next one is not as familiar, but Joseph Seligman, along with Kuhn, along with Schiff. Those 3 names will be synonymous with each other for what we were talking about earlier. And this is going to be one of the great Jewish banking groups that really challenged even what was the biggest bank at the time? Challenged, whatever. Morgan, thank you, JP Morgan. So Seligman was the banker. He started Seligman and Company.
Right.
He, of course, came from Bavaria, like they all came from Bavaria. So assume they all were born sometime in the 18 teens. Most of them came in the 1840s, before the Civil War. He met his wife, I believe, on the boat coming over, and started this banking empire. He first started as a clerk and a cashier. And just coincidentally, the guy he was clerking for would become a United States congressman, giving him a lot of connections. His family was actually doing pretty well before all the issues. He comes from a family that's in the wool business, so he actually did go to college, go to university before he came to America at 17, deciding not to stay in the family business. He, unlike the rest, though, would eventually move back and live in his home country, leaving the business to those who had partnered with. So he worked, he saved up money, he brought over his brothers, as all of them did. Of course, Levi Strauss was the opposite. His brother brought him over, but Seligman brought his brothers over here, and they created first several stores in Alabama. He started by perusing places, going out and selling merchandise on his days off or his free time to the farmers, eventually starts his own store, and then eventually they moved to New York and he becomes part of this Art Crowd group. He was, of course, wonderfully enough, the president of the synagogue there. During the Civil War, he created, or he bought, I'm not exactly understanding, but he, I think the word is disposed of, $200 million in bonds for the winning sides. And so he ended up then using this experience to promote companies that were in the railroad business, including the Missouri Pacific, Atlantic and Pacific, South Pacific, Missouri, Kansas, Texas railroads. So he ended up going into these, participating in what they would call the stock and bond issues of both the railroad, the steel industry, the wire industry. So really wide variety. And of course, there were a lot of anti-Semitic rants about how he had done some things he shouldn't have in terms of knowing what the government was going to do beforehand and taking advantage of it. So he befriended the president of the United States. Grant was even offered a major post in Grant's cabinet. He turned it down, and that became one of the issues. But I'm going to talk about, has everybody heard of Joseph Seligman? You may have heard of Kuhn Moore. You may have heard of Schiff Moore. I hope sometimes I confuse which one is which because I don't understand banking and I don't understand all these specifics. But he became famous for the first major publicized anti-Semitic incident in America. And this is the one that led to, funny enough or ironically enough, to the gentleman's agreement in the hotel industry. So he had a rivalry with a gentleman named Henry Hilton, who bought a hotel or had in New York that Seligman had stayed in various times. In 1877, he went to stay at the hotel, the Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga, a place for wealthy people, especially in New York, and he was not allowed in. Now, they don't know if he was kicked out or if he knew ahead of time he wasn't going to be allowed in and he wanted to promote it. Jeff may know more than I do. I know the situation, but again, I don't think it's proven either way. But what did happen is that the New York Times read an article on what happened at this Saratoga hotel and the new rules that Jews were not allowed in. Now, remember, this idea of Jews not being allowed in hotels was a little bit around, but really became more around, I think, after the Eastern European immigration, when so many of them came. I got Seligman confused with somebody else. He didn't move back to Bavaria. Anyway, because of this, that hotel was actually closed, but it led to other hotels feeling they could do it and putting up signs like Hebrews not apply and Hebrews will knock vainly for admission. So because he was fighting anti-Semitism, he ended up, of course, helping to instill this in the hotel industry, which is really kind of ironic in many ways, obviously. So he of course, was close with Jacob H. Schiff, who we'll talk about in a second. And who was Jacob H. Schiff? But any questions or thoughts before? Yes.
Rabbi, did he turn around and buy the hotel? Because often you hear the stories when we couldn't get in, we turned around and bought them.
He did not. He did not buy the hotel. It went under, but he did not buy it. He
Okay.
bought a lot of other stuff. He helped in Standard, the oil company. He joined with the Vanderbilts. He had investments all around the world. But I think he did a lot of what you would call stock and bond issues, which I am not. I know what it generally means, but I'm not exactly sure. But he helped to finance railroads after the Civil War.
Yes.
He helped to create bonds. So again, other ones did the same thing, although he did. So
He was known as the major Jewish house of banking, in America, and the railroad influence was mainly out west.
right,
And of course, he came in. Bond issue was the way that businesses went and countries went.
right, got
Countries
money.
would come to them. France, England, all the South American countries would raise their financing through these huge bond
Yeah.
issues. And
Well, what happened in the
But he didn't do as much as some of the others that we'll talk about, like
he was in conflict with the Morgans because
Yes.
of the business and the railroad business. They really got in conflict over.
What happened about the hotel?
the hotel closed.
The
Yeah.
hotel closed.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was that was such a scandal that Morgan, who himself was very anti-Semitic, came to his defense and bawled out the hotel and Hilton for excluding, not because he was a gentleman.
Right.
Morgan considered him a gentleman, and no gentleman ever should be barred from any hotel.
yeah,
Um,
and that was really the irony, because although they were I don't know if they were bitter enemies, whereas like when Morgan was very famous for aggressiveness, but they certainly were. But he was a bigger enemy with the guy Henry Hilton, who was a judge who bought the hotel or who owned it, than I think Morgan in many ways. And it had to do with a complicated issue because he did not take the job of Secretary of the Treasury and from Ulysses S. Grant, and then ended up being becoming an enemy of the Secretary of State under Rutherford Hayes. So there's all these issues of people being, and so Alexander Stewart, who had been a colleague of his, then became very much his enemy, and I'm not exactly sure what happened, but Hilton became connected with Stewart and Tammany Hall, and Seligman ended up serving on another committee. Seligman didn't invite Stewart, I think, to a party he held for Grant after he became president. So it's all these little things.
Right. That's what I got to get caught up. Was that in our crowd?
Yeah, that was our crowd. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I have to.
Basically, our crowd is almost any of the German Jewish bigwigs who started 1840 to 78, sometime in there. So if you were, that was what they became known as. I don't even know if it was at the time what they were considered or later. But Jacob Schiff would become the most philanthropic of all of them in many ways. But we'll talk about first Abraham Kuhn, who is the one I got confused with, who moved back eventually. So he, of course, is from the Rhineland, what is now the Rhineland, so not Bavaria. And he married Regina Loeb, who is the sister of Solomon Loeb, who of course would become his partner. So they were Indiana Jews. They became partners, of course, first starting as peddlers. And then they started supplying uniforms to the military and made a fortune because they were also manufacturing the clothes. But then they turned away from clothing, and Kuhn and Loeb went into banking and took advantage of what was happening after the Civil War and started a major banking company, eventually hiring Jacob Schiff, who we'll talk about in a second. Kuhn, however, died pretty early on in the formation, not in the company, and in 1892. And so Schiff is really going to take it on to another level. And you've probably heard of Jacob Schiff. Some of you may have heard of Loeb, some of you have Kuhn. But when they took Schiff on, and of course Schiff was a banker already in Europe and a philanthropist, and he was born in Frankfurt, Germany, so a little bit more, obviously, of the more industrial area. And so he was born there, and he comes from a very impressive background with rabbis, connections to the Rothschilds. So he was in America. He was already a broker. He was already very prominent when Kuhn and Loeb invited him to join the company in 1875, only a few years before Kuhn would die. And so he came over and became the head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and then just took off, sponsoring railroads, electric companies, Western Union, went into competition with, of course, JP Morgan, was director of every single company you can name. But what did he do most famously? First, Jewish philanthropy. But what's really interesting about Schiff is he is one of the people who took the idea of creating bonds for other countries to another level. Up until 1905, there had never been in the history of modern Western countries, a modern Western country who had lost a war to a non-Western country. It had just not happened until, of course, Schiff came in to the picture. And who, did I lose everybody? Sorry. And Schiff was, did I forget something? Okay, sorry. So Schiff did something incredible. He set up bonds for who? Does anybody know? This is very famous. He set up bonds for the Japanese. That's what made him really famous, because he set up bonds for them during the Russo-Japanese War and basically helped to finance the entire war for the Japanese. Obvious, this would have long-term implications as the Japanese would become very modern and eventually go to war with America, but this is long before that.
That was right.
So he helped them basically defeat Russia, and of course was given every award possible from Japan, and also then helped to finance and funds for the First World War, of course, at the time, the Great War, and went out of his way to do anything he could to fund anyone fighting with Russia. He thought Tsarist Russia was the most anti-Semitic, worst country on earth. And so He did this, and of course,
Germany came along.
eventually backed the Bolsheviks before they turned anti-Semitic, and then backed the anti-Bolsheviks, and became very famous for doing this. He became most famous, though, because he became one of these people who just was very philanthropic, giving time and money to almost every Jewish organization. Hebrew Union College, the Reform College for rabbis, the Jewish Theological Seminary for conservative rabbis. He set up an immigrant point of entry for Jews in Galveston. He helped to create and fund the AJC, the Jewish Young Men's Hebrew Association. Then he also did it for non-Jewish associations, Boy Scouts, Harvard, American Museum of Natural History. I mean, basically American Red Cross, just everything. So basically, he was promoting so many prominent Jewish causes that there became what we would know a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric about him, especially a lot of these conspiracy theories about what he did. He also was a secular Zionist, so helped to fund various enterprises in Israel, including the Technical Institute of Haifa. So again, philanthropic, worked for first Kuhn and Loeb, who had formed this banking and then took it over and took it to the next level. And of course, his children, his son would take over the business. So these are some of the major ones. We'll do one or two more. Larry.
Rabbi, were there German banks? Well, I've heard there were German banks during World War I, prior to America's entry into World War I, that wanted to keep the United States out of the war. They were actually very pro-German. Was Schiff one of those? Was Kuhn Loeb or Schiff?
No, they were the opposite. There were those who were trying. Germany desperately wanted to keep America out of the war, obviously, but he, I believe, was on the other side. He was funding a wide range of other groups that were fighting Russia. So in Germany, at first, was Germany? First at the beginning, I don't remember if Germany was fighting Russia or not. Eventually, obviously, they would. But at the very beginning,
well, Germany and
Russia would go against Germany.
Right. They
At
had
the very beginning, I can't remember if there was some talks, but I don't believe so. So, but that could be wrong on that. We'd have to check and see, because he really was, he was friends with the president at the time. So you would think he would be funding the banks supporting the side America went in on for that war.
Yeah, well, it wasn't until, obviously there were other U-boat incidents and things like that that obviously brought it over the top to bring America into the war. But
right.
But there were a lot of German banks that were really financing, or trying to keep America out of the war.
That is definitely true, that they were definitely trying to keep him out.
Yeah.
And the same that in the next World War as well, trying to keep him out.
On another country, though, the Dreyfus affair was a cataclysmic event, sort of, in the formation of thought toward Zionism, right, and those kinds of things. But did the French, first of all, and this may be another subject in itself, what led to this rash of anti-Semitism in France? And did many French come to the United States? You don't hear about French bankers and French immigration around that same time.
Not at the same level, but you have to understand all of this starts with Napoleon. Napoleon knocked over the first domino, and different countries went in different directions. France ended up unifying itself, but going into almost what we call a continual civil war for a very long time, all the way through the beginning of the 20th century. The Civil War in France was this underneath schism between those who wanted a monarchy and those who wanted a more democratic country. And this schism would last almost 100 years. And the height of the schism just happened to be in the 1890s, right during the Dreyfus affair. So funny enough, what happened is the party and the people who were more democratic became known as the Dreyfusonians. And those who were pro-monarchy became known as the anti-Dreyfusonians. That's how important I mean, it's forgotten in history except for how it influenced the creation of the state of Israel. But it's one of the seminal moments of France in the 19th century, because it was the height of whether France was going to go one way or the other. And he was so important that the parties themselves were both named after him. I mean, think about how crazy that is. That would be like, the parties today being named the Rosendorfs versus the anti-Rosendorfs. I mean, that's literally what happened. And the irony again is that he could have cared less. He was in the military. He was a good French. He didn't care about any of this. He didn't care about Israel. He didn't care about Zionism. He didn't care about politics. He just got caught up in the middle of it. We can do a whole thing on that if you want separately.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
But all of this is because of Napoleon.
But it never really led to a large migration of Jews.
It did not. It did not. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, but there wasn't the number of Jews in France that there would be later. And a lot of them appreciated the fact that the anti-Semitism in France at this point never reached the heights that it did in Germany or in Russia. But you also have to remember, France also at this time was the most educated place on earth. So along with the anti-Dreyfusonians and the Dreyfusonians, you had all the educated intellectuals moving and studying in France. Marx is going there from Germany, and Picasso and Monet and Marx going from Germany to there. And this is the height of the 19th century where they thought, this intellectualism was going to fix the world, that was going to be the way of peace, this idea of science. And so why would you want to leave France to go to America? America, although you could do well business-wise, was still not considered the place for the intellectual elite. That wouldn't be till the 20th century. So some did come and do business, but you didn't see this large-scale immigration as from Germany. But by the 1890s, there was not a large-scale immigration from Germany to America of Jews anymore because the country had stabilized. Flossie.
Rabbi, could you talk about the Strauss family where you're going to?
We're good. We're running out of time here, so we could do this next week. If we want, we could do the Strausses, the Goldmans, the Sachs. We could do the who else did I forget to do? I didn't do, so again, we could go into all these things. It's just, we got so much going on right now. We only got 5 minutes. If you want, we can do that next week, and then we could talk about Dreyfus, which I'm very familiar with. Yeah. Michael.
Unmute. One of the things, even though they were so philanthropic, I seem to remember from reading Our Crowd a few decades ago that these were all German Jews, these were all Reformed Jews.
Yeah.
Their contribution to the Jewish experience in New York, in a sense, was kind of mixed. Is that
That's
right?
Very much true. It was not religious in nature, save for maybe Schiff. Schiff was a little different than the rest, but it's mostly cultural, and it's mostly social action, social justice oriented. Now you got to remember, I'm making them all seem like really nice people. Some of them were not nice people. They were cutthroat. They were sometimes pompous. They were also very intertwined with each other. But they were really influential. And one of the things that they did was help the Eastern European immigrants coming to America by creating a lot of organizations. Again, as we've talked about before, they didn't want them in their houses. They didn't want them in their synagogues or at the country clubs where they were, but they did want to help them. So they gave incredible amounts of money to help, assimilate these Eastern European Jews who, of course, were much more behind the 8 ball than the German. The German Jews who came here came from an intellectual society, even if they were living in the middle of nowhere. Most of their parents were in some sort of business venture and were educated. They could speak German, which in America went a long way as opposed to Yiddish or Russian. So a lot of Germans moved to America. It wasn't just the German Jews. Yes, Larry.
Yeah, I was just going to say the Bremen Museum did a terrific talk about a couple of weeks ago about in Atlanta, there were different zones, and there was the zone in the northern part that was predominantly the German Jews, and the zone in the southern part of Atlanta, which was predominantly the Eastern European Jews, and they were pretty much
really?
separate and segregated. Yeah, if you look at that map, it was almost as though there were two separate communities. And I remember hearing
Really?
talk in Newark, New Jersey, about how even papers like the Forward, tried to Americanize the Eastern European Jews and tried to, they were embarrassed by them. They were embarrassed by their accent, and they were separated in different areas of Newark at the time, which had a very large Jewish community as well as parts of New York.
Yeah, that was kind of, what I was, getting at was, how they really kind of looked down on a lot of the Eastern European Jews, and they were so focused on assimilation,
right,
that those who didn't, they were kind of shunned, if that's the right word, and it may be a little strong, but they just really didn't want them.
Well,
even though they helped them.
right. It was
them.
yeah, it was kind of a shunning, but it wasn't a shunning. It was more of a go live over there and we'll help you, but we don't want to hang with you.
Yeah.
We want you to become looking like us. And when you can do that, then we'll talk. So, and this happened across America. You can almost always tell which synagogues were German and which were not by the date they were created. Obviously, if they were founded anywhere from 1820 to 1880, they were most likely German Jewish money. They also helped the conservative movement quite a bit, because the conservative movement, they felt, was one of the ways to integrate these people religiously, because it was more religious, but it was not Orthodox, so they could become Americanized and still keep some of these trappings. And plus they could start their own synagogues and we'll help fund them. So a lot of the Eastern European synagogues were funded by Reform Jewish money, even though they were conservative. And it was, and a lot of these organizations we think of today, AJC, AJ Congress, Jewish Free Loan, were created at various times to help these Eastern European immigrants. They, again, were a little different. The Germans, when they moved here, they spoke German, but German was a well-regarded language in America. There had been lots of Germans who had come to America, even in Texas. There's whole areas of Texas that were settled by Germans, not German Jews. They also came here dressing like people of America, because remember, America was taking a lot of its fashion from Europe. It filtered down. So they came over here, they looked like these Americans. They talked German. They had an accent, but they had an accent very similar to other people. Remember, Germany is the language spoken by a good portion of Europe, Switzerland, Finland, I'm losing all the names, parts of Eastern Europe, Poland, parts of France, Netherlands, they're all speaking German. And so it was it's very similar to our, hillbilly cousins moving to Savannah or to Sun City area. And we don't want them to hang with us because they're embarrassing, but we don't want them to be destitute and die. And so that was basically what happened. And this was around the country. Obviously, New York, they also financed them going to other places around the country, not just to get rid of them, but to really, they knew that being stuck in New York, they were going to be at a disadvantage. And they knew from past histories that if you sent Jews with, funding to smaller towns around the country, that they would be able to thrive and succeed, because they're competing against people in Nebraska and Texas, and they're not competing against the elite of New York. And so they help fund a lot of that. So a lot of the, the dry goods salespeople were getting their goods from these German Jewish companies that were financing them to help themselves, but also to help these Jews. So, and just like in the book Second to None, if you came to a town and there were Jews here, and they would say, this is what's, you came to Savannah, you're Jewish, no matter who you were, German or they would say, this is what's available to you here, but let me tell you what's going on. If you go to Milledgeville, I can fund you to start your store in Milledgeville, or to start your store in what's the Brunswick, or and that's how this happened.
That's why there are Chinese restaurants everywhere in the country. Seriously,
that is very true.
The families would fund their relatives to go to places so that they could make a living by opening restaurants. There's a wonderful documentary on that. I don't remember whether it's Prime or I think it's on Prime, if it's still around.
Well, that's one of the good, really interesting books. It's a personal story called The Jew Store is another good one, where they're funding people. He goes to a certain city, Nashville, and they say, listen, there's nothing for you here, but we like the fact you have all of this experience in merchandising. We want to merchandise in this area. Can we send you there? And he says, yes. People also have to realize that there was not an incredible amount of anti-Semitism around the country as we have today. There were simply not enough Jews, and they weren't prominent enough. You had a few of them, but most of them were in New York. But it wasn't like millions. It was, and they'd go to these towns, and they could not join the country club, obviously, but they were welcomed into society as much as anyone. Even though they were outsiders, they were not fearful for their lives. They were not fearful for their businesses. People would use them, understood they had skills that were needed. And this was everywhere. The major anti-Semitism really started with Eastern immigration. People don't mind small numbers of individuals coming. I live in a city of 10,000 and I have 27 Jewish families coming into town. Great. I live in a town of 10,000 people and I have 7,000 Jews coming into town, taking jobs away. That's an issue. And so that's why Jews are all, it's the irony that Jews went all around the country and now they're all going to the big cities because there's really no anti-Semitism that's preventing them from getting jobs. Larry.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody caught, I sent out a link to a Jewish Literacy Center, had something on what they called the co-ops, or coops, they called it, in the Bronx.
Yes.
And it was amazing because at the same time that many of the Jewish banks, as you say, were financing the Russo-Japanese war against the Russians, these coops were starting up and they were tremendously communistic. They had 4 housing developments that had grown out of tenements in the Lower East Side that were financed. And these became some of the largest populations for Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe that had come there. And they were so pro-communist that they had open communist rallies, and they were, on everybody's list as the communist. Some were more radical than the others, but the documentary, something called Utopia or something. This was their Utopia, is a fantastic documentary. I hope.
Okay, we'll just see that.
May have caught it the other day. Then I sent out the link, and then they had the director there of the film. But it is a magnificent film, and what led to the demise there of the Communist Party in that particular area was when Stalin and Hitler signed the non-aggression agreement prior to World War II. They said, "Wow, this isn't the communism that we had signed up for." Right. But their idea of utopia was for the Jewish people to start this revolution within the Bronx and then take over throughout the whole country.
Yeah, my grandparents had friends who lived there, and I got dragged there several times. And these people I knew even as a young child. They were devoted communists, and this is in the early to mid 50s.
Oh, it was
You
even
know?
earlier than that because it disestablished.
Right.
50s.
No, I saw the film.
Yeah,
I saw the
yeah.
film, but they were still there.
1920s,
I mean, it
yeah,
hadn't turned yet.
right after the Russian Revolution, and they were very,
Yeah.
very much still pro-communists.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing, these stories. And again, what we talked about today is basically these Jews, almost all, they're all born in Germany, often in Bavaria, but other places, coming from not well, one or two are well-to-do, but generally comfortable families, living in a world that was becoming very, what's the word? Not dissolution, but the world that was becoming almost going crazy. Civil disabilities, civil war seeming, industry versus agrarianism, anti-Semitism on the rise. If you don't have certain context, not getting privileges. And so they left, coming with education, bringing family, or coming to meet family who had already come here. One of the reasons they all came individually is because Jews couldn't own land. And so many of the Germans who came to America, they sold their property, and they used that money to fund everybody coming to America. But the Jews did not have couldn't own land. So they usually had to come one at a time, and they'd come in America and then pay for everybody to come over, and came to America, and they found a country that was much more open and had a lot of fields that were being controlled by people who did not have their experience or their fortitude or their knowledge or their intelligence. And so they were able to see and take advantage of these areas, often by going out west, but eventually also going to New York. And again, it was almost in every field because most of the fields had not become forbidden to Jews yet. So from mining to railroads, to banking, to finance, to commercialism. So just the fact that they could buy property was probably pretty exciting to them. And so always born, usually always from 1840s to 1870s-ish is where they made most of the wealth, some of them in the 1820s, but most of them 1840s to 1870s. And then usually brought in other people, and the companies they founded continued on for many generations afterwards, a few of them to this very day. Even in my lifetime, Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers have closed down or been bought out. So that's, over 100 years later, which is pretty impressive.
Next time, Rabbi, could you do a little bit even on the Revolutionary War, the Jews that financed the American Revolution, where they came?
We could talk about that. We could do that, or we could talk about the Dreyfus. We could talk about.
Oh, no, either one. I mean, I'd like to do both. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you have, did you say the Civil War or the Revolutionary War? Sorry.
Well, the Revolution. I was going back, essentially.
The Revolutionary War is very apropos because one of the top 5 was a member of our congregation.
Right,
So
right, yeah.
He may even been number 2 after Solomon.
Solomon, of course. And
yeah, I can invite. In fact, I could probably invite some people who are very much more knowledgeable about this to tell the personal story of what happened at our synagogue and how influential Moses Sheftel, Mordechai Sheftel, and others. What's her name? Abigail Minus as well, I think, played a part of her family.
Rabbi, we got to run, so we want to say goodbye.
brother's
Thank you
leaving.
very
Okay,
much.
so next week we'll do Jews in the American Revolution. I'm going to invite Herbert and Teresa Victor and maybe Margie Levy to help us with that one.
all right,
Thank you,
great.
Rabbi.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.